So I'm not a mind reader, but I wonder if I could predict what maybe some of you were thinking as Mackenzie was very ably reading through this passage. A list of names. Really, that's what we're going to be spending the next, however many minutes on. Like, Geoff is basically going to be preaching from the phone book. If you're Gen Z, talk to your parents if you don't know what I'm talking about there. A list of names and hellos. Really. Except if you notice, actually, about 2/3 of the way through, Paul kind of interrupts this list and he starts talking about crushing Satan. Like, that's what we have in verse 20. The God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. If you know, some of these passages, during Advent, we sometimes actually look at Genesis 3, where we see humanity's great failure brought about by the serpent, by Satan. And it seems like even as the story begins, it's already over for us. We are disconnected from God. We're sentenced to death. But then God says these words. He promises that there will come a descendant from Adam and Eve who will crush the head of the serpent. And we understand that rightly to be speaking about Jesus, who in his death and resurrection defeated Satan. And yet here we are told that there is a way that Christians join with Jesus in crushing Satan. The verse right before that helps us understand a little bit more, I think, what Paul is talking about. Verse 19, he says, "Your obedience is known to all." Throughout Romans, obedience is Paul's way of speaking of conversion, of turning to Christ. And he's saying, word of you becoming Christians is spreading. People are hearing about this new community that is forming in Rome. And this legend, this story, this awareness of what's taking place is causing people to take note and think, maybe there is something to this gospel if this is what's going on. And as is always the case, whenever God is at work doing something that is bringing people to himself, so also Satan seeks to involve himself. It is clear that Satan, wherever something like that happens, is going to try to turn it for his purposes. Is going to try to corrupt it, try to ruin it. And so Paul is warning the church, look, what's happening right now is public and it's glorious. So here's what you need to do. Be skillful, wise as to what is good. Be innocent. Be resistant to evil. And if you do that, the God of peace will crush Satan under your feet. And if you wonder what it is to do that, well, that actually is what this entire chapter is about. See, since chapter 12, Paul has been describing the kind of community that Jesus makes through his death and resurrection, that he has made possible. And here in chapter 16, he's now moving from describing it to showing it. To understand what I mean, let's just back up for a moment and try to understand a little bit about what it would be like to be in the Roman society in that day. In Rome in that day, the entire idea of human equality that we just take for granted, of course, all humans are equal, would have been seen not just as wrong, but as absurd. Of course, there is not equality. Of course, there is a hierarchy that makes society holds together. At the very top are Roman free men. If you are those three things, a Roman citizen, and you are free, and you are man, then life is pretty good for you. If within that time you were a woman, well, you're always under the rule of the patriarch, whether that's your father or your husband. You're not allowed to vote. Probably won't get much of an education. And you have very little status. But at least you're not a foreigner, like a Jew. See, Jews don't even have rights. So, if an emperor decides that they want to just kind of say, all Jews have to leave Rome, Jews will just have to do that, which is exactly what happened a few years ago. You're lower on the scale. But at least if you're a Jew, you're not a slave. Because slaves are at the very bottom. Slaves were given the status just a little bit above the way we treat our appliances today. They were to be used, insignificant. That's how society holds together, with a clear hierarchy of status, of importance. It is not equal. And when you understand that, if you look at our passage here, you will begin to notice some things that are a little bit strange. So do you notice how Paul starts as he's extending these greetings? He begins by talking about our sister, Phoebe, who seems to be the person who is bringing the letter to the church in Rome. And notice she's described as a servant, or it could just as easily be translated a deacon of the church in Cenchreae. She has status. And that status continues to be given when you see that she's described as a patron, someone who's important in supporting both Paul and others. And so Paul says, give her the help of whatever she needs. She is treated as significant. A woman. And it's not just her. The very next verse, you have this kind of power couple within the missionary world of that day, Prisca and Aquila, who have all sorts of significance. We read about them in Acts as well, and who's named first amongst these two? Well, it's Prisca, or Priscilla, a woman. Later on, you have Andronicus and Junius, also a husband and wife missionary pair, both being honored. You have Mary, who is being honored as someone who's been working hard for the cause. Again and again, what do we see? We see women who are being described and honored with great status as equals in significance within this congregation. And that's not the only thing that's unusual. Some of these people, Paul very explicitly says, are his fellow Jews. And yet others are very clearly Greeks or Romans, people who are not Jews, and yet they are side by side in this church. Perhaps even harder for us to notice, we definitely see some people who are wealthy. Priscilla and Aquila have a church meeting in their house. Quite possibly they are in the upper class. But some of these names, scholars will tell you, like Urbanus and Amplianus, and then later at the very end, Tertius, these are names that are only given to slaves. And yet they are named. They are honored. They are significant. The status levels, the hierarchy that was just the way things were done are not being done here. It is very difficult to communicate just how strange this was. In that day, this would have been the only place in all of the world where a slave and nobility might stand side by side and sing the same hymns together as equals. Where men and women, where their contributions and their involvement in what's going on were seen as equal and significant and honored. Where a Jew and a Gentile would embrace each other as brothers and sisters. This was nothing short of a miracle. And what makes this miracle possible is something that Paul is at pains to show by just repeating a simple phrase, two different phrases, meaning the same thing again and again. Perhaps you noticed, or perhaps it was so common you didn't. Welcome her in the Lord. Priscilla and Aquila are my workers in Christ Jesus. If you keep going on, you'll see that again and again. In verse 7, they were in Christ before me. Verse 8, Amplianus, my beloved in the Lord. Verse 9, Urbanus, our fellow worker in Christ. Again and again, there is one bond that binds all of these people who are so disparate, who seem to have no business being together, and that's Jesus. This community happens because they are in Christ. If you've been with us for a while, you'll know that this idea of in Christ is in many ways, you could say, an identity statement. The identity statement above all other identity statements. That when someone entrusts themselves to Jesus, in other words, when someone becomes a Christian, they entirely become Jesus's. And Jesus entirely becomes theirs. He is their king. He is their North Star. He is their everything. And so when someone comes to be in Christ, there is now a new power that is at work within them, binding them to everyone else who is in Christ. So think for a moment about what we see in the life of Jesus. Jesus, I think we can easily say, is person who was the most powerful human being who ever existed. With a single word, he caused demons to flee in terror. With a single word, he caused a hurricane to become serene. With a single word, he undid death itself. And what does he do with that power? Does he decide, now is the time for me to get the status and the glory, to gather every army and the angels around me to take over Rome? No, he uses all of the power that God has given him to lay down his life, to go to the shame of the cross, to rescue people who do not deserve it. He gave himself with all of his power in love. And ever since, anyone who is in Christ, who has him as their North Star and their King, follows in the same suit, which means the community of Jesus looks different. And in the community of Jesus, there is no longer a status difference. There is no longer divisions along certain tribal lines. In the community of Jesus, there is not a pursuit of power, but there is a pursuit of love. And it is extraordinary. It was extraordinary in the day of Rome, and it is extraordinary in our day as well. We are in a time where everyone talks about identity politics, right? Where, if I'm a man, I'm supposed to somehow desire things that are powerful or different from what women want, or if I'm an upper class, I'm pursuing something different from what people in the lower class. The idea is that all of society is just one massive, 17-way tug of war. And all of us are fighting for control. Which makes what is happening in the church just as extraordinary today as it was then. Because in the society of people who are in Jesus, when it is working the way it is supposed to, what do we see? We see men and women. We see white-collar, wealthy, and blue-collar shift workers. We see black and white. We even see Republicans and Democrats come side by side together because of the unity that they have in Jesus. And let me tell you, when that happens the way it's supposed to, the world takes notice. Which is why also, when that happens the way it's supposed to, Satan seeks to undermine it. Satan, I think, understands something that we often do not, and that is that it is incredibly significant how we relate to each other in terms of how it affects the mission that we have been given to the world around us. I don't think we have any idea of just how many people have been turned away from the gospel and from Jesus because they have seen something in the church, hypocrisy, cruelty, divisiveness, that has just made them feel sour on the whole thing. I also suspect that none of us have any idea of just how powerful, when someone sees a community that loves each other in a way that doesn't make sense, how powerful it is for showing that the gospel has something true to it. And so this is what Paul is talking about when he says, there is a cosmic battle that is going on, and your calling is to crush Satan, to see God crush Satan. How do you do that? By being wise, by being skillful, by pursuing that which is truly good in this community. And by being innocent, by resisting, by recognizing how Satan is going to try to tear it apart, and instead doing your best to protect against it. How do we do that? Well, this also is what Paul shows us in our passage. There are kind of two elements to the passage about how, in this battleground of protecting his church and the witness of the church, there is both the idea of deepening what is going on and also of defending. There is this idea of greeting, and there's also this idea of protecting against. So let's just kind of look at both of these for a moment. First, for us to be battling, to be wise, to be skillful in what is good, we see a call to greet. I don't know if you noticed, it's the command that's repeated again and again and again and again. And it happens so often that we just might miss it. But here it is at verse 2. Greet Prisca and Aquila. And it keeps going. Greet the church. Greet Mary. It keeps going all the way until we get to verse 16, where finally after Paul is saying, say hello to all these people, or however we might think of greeting, greet one another with a holy kiss. All the churches of Christ greet you. I just said it's kind of like Paul saying hello to you, but it's more than that. Greeting was more than just polite pleasantries. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, when he is talking about how we are called to love our enemies, he at one point says, if you only greet your family, that's no different from the Gentiles. And it's clear when he's saying that, he's not just saying if you only say hello to your family. Greeting in that day had more weight than just a hello. To greet someone was an expression of relationship. It was an expression of welcome, with the arms open wide. The word actually has kind of the context sometimes of embracing. It was a sign of commitment. It was a sign of a significant relationship. And Paul says, greet one another. In fact, he says more than that, doesn't he? He says, greet one another with a holy kiss. Which I'd like all of us to do right now. I just wanted to see if I could make any of you uncomfortable. But you need to understand, in that day, the holy kiss was a kiss was common. In public, people would kiss family members or even close friends as a sign of affection, as a sign of honoring. It was an outward expression of a significant relationship. And when Paul says, greet one another with a holy kiss, what he's saying is, you should do your best outwardly, daily, regularly, to express the relationship that you have with everyone else within this church community. Notice, it's not just a kiss, it's a holy kiss. Because in these actions, in these practices, you are showing something about what Jesus himself has done. About the relationship that he has created amongst everyone else who has placed their faith in Jesus. What is that relationship? Well, we see a few different ways that Paul describes it. Paul lets us know that if you are in Christ, then you are brothers and sisters. You are family to everyone else who calls on Jesus' name. So notice how at the very beginning, when he calls Phoebe our sister, and later on he will talk about our brother. He talks about Rufus' mother being like my mother as well. There is clearly a family relationship that has been created because in Jesus, God is our Father, and we are now bound to each other. And when we hear that, when we hear, oh, we're brothers and sisters, there's part of us like, oh, that's nice. It feels kind of sentimental, but you need to realize that in that day, family meant more than that. Family meant obligation. In that day, there was no welfare system. If someone was in a difficult place, if you were their cousin, or especially if you were their brother or sister, it was your duty to make sure that person was taken care of. And so when Paul is calling each other brothers and sisters, he's saying you have an obligation to each other. And when he's saying greet each other, he's saying recognize that, express that you are family. Make that the ongoing way you experience your relationship with each other. And he's saying that to us as well. What's more, perhaps, do you notice that one of the other titles that Paul uses again and again is this idea of laborer, co-worker. Again and again, we have some sort of idea of a fellow laborer in the Lord. And what he's saying is that the moment that you come to Christ, you join in the mission of Jesus. You are now part of the work of God, seeking to bring yourself and your church and all of the world under the loving, freeing rule of Jesus. And that work is hard work. I mean, verse 6, Mary, she has worked hard for you. Or Priscilla and Aquila, they risked their necks for me. Or Andronicus and Junia are people who are prisoners with me. It's clear that the work that they are engaging in is costly. But what's important also to realize is that the work they are engaging in is shared. All who are in Christ are fellow laborers. We are all working towards this glorious goal that Jesus has given us, which means we need each other. We depend upon each other. And when Paul is saying greet one another, he's saying recognize in the way you speak to each other and care for each other that you are on the same team, working in the trenches towards the same glorious goal. You are fellow workers. And that is also how we should experience things. And in addition to family and fellow workers, notice a third way that he speaks. Do you see one of the words that's repeated? For example, in verse 5, greet my beloved Epaenetus. My beloved Epaenetus. And that term beloved comes again and again. And he's not using that word just because these are the ones those are his favorites. He's kind of modeling what he said in chapter 12. Love one another with brotherly affection. That is, we don't just have the bonds of working together or even belonging to each other as family. We have bonds of affection. In Christ Jesus, we're friends. And this also is what we are meant to express every time we are greeting each other, every time we interact with one another. If you are a Christian, then you have been brought into a web of relationships. You have been brought into a family. You've been brought into this collective project. You have brought into friendships with every other believer, not only here, but throughout the world. It's an extraordinary thing to experience. When Jennifer and I moved to Australia, a place we had never been, where we knew no one, we immediately were welcomed in and loved as family and as friends. And we realized we are totally on the same team, even though we've never met you. And every time we've moved, we've experienced that again and again. And it's all the more true here. If you are a Christian, even if the person in front of you, in the row in front of you or behind you, you have never met before, if they are a believer as well, they are your family. They are your co-worker. They are your friend. Which I realize kind of feels a little weird. Because we are, in a time where you kind of have to have a testing out period for relationships, right? There needs to be kind of this proving where you kind of decide, do I really like this person or not, before you kind of move to that next level of deeper relationship. And the kingdom of Jesus, it just works the very opposite. It starts with the fact that you already are in that towards each other. You already are friends. You already are family. And really, the only calling you have is to kind of learn how to live into that. You don't need to somehow break into the inner circle. There is no cool kids club that you need to somehow earn your way into. There is nothing you need to do to belong. In Jesus, you already fully and entirely belong to this web of loving relationships that He and He alone can create. Now, I realize that is describing how things are in some ways at one level, but oftentimes that's not how it feels. And that is where the battleground is. Our calling is, in every way we can, with the way that we treat each other, that we greet each other, where we welcome each other, to make this thing that is already real more and more what our experience is amongst each other. So what does that look like? What does it look like to greet one another? Sure, kiss or hug. It also means at times texting someone with a kind text, asking how they're doing, or when you see someone, really asking and checking in on them. It means sometimes welcoming your home to others and inviting them in because they're family. It means sometimes making meals for someone when they're sick. There are so many different ways that I could not list, but we can think through what are different ways in our practice, day in, day out, we can show each other that they are family and friends, even before we know them very well. This is not easy, honestly, for me. I'm from New England. I'm reserved. I kind of feel like I need permission before I show any levels of friendliness. And here, if you are like me, you need to know Jesus has already given you permission. You can already show welcome to people, and it's okay if you scare them a little bit. Because this is actually the reality into which we find ourselves. We do battle against Satan by upholding the reality and seeking to love each other as we have been called to. But there is a second. We talked about there's greeting, there is deepening, but on the other hand, there is also this call to watch out, to defend. We see this in verse 17, and we'll spend a little bit less time with this, but we still need to pay attention to it, because here we see kind of where Satan goes more on the offensive. I appeal to you, brothers, to watch out. He says to watch out the people who are teachers. And these teachers, we actually don't know much about. Commentators try to figure out, was this very specific people Paul had in mind, or is he kind of warning ahead of time about things that he anticipates might happen? What we do know is that what Paul is talking about is speakers and writers who are very effective. Notice in verse 18 it says, they have smooth talk and they flatter, and in doing so they deceive the hearts of the naive. They're able to speak with great confidence and tell stories that will captivate you. They are funny, you feel moved, and honestly, as they are speaking, you feel kind of good about them yourself. That they flatter you to make you feel smarter and better, and that is a potent combination. And that might not be that big of a deal, except for the fact that they, in their motivation, we're told, are not seeking to serve Jesus. They are seeking to serve their own desires. They're wanting to gain a following, and they don't care what it costs. And so what they end up bringing about is not the things that we want to see in the church. What they end up bringing about is disruption and dissension and stumbling blocks that disconnects people from Jesus. See, and I think this is kind of shown sociologically. If you have the right gifts, it is not that hard to kind of gain a tribe, to gain a following. Really, the cheapest, the easiest, the most efficient way to do it is to find a group of people who are the out group and to make them the bad guys and to stir up fear and to stir up anger and to unite a bunch of people, making them all feel we are good because we are not them and they are terrible. You can see it in countless ways in society throughout the world. You can see it in the church. In the 19th century, there was this great suspicion of those who are highly educated. They were treated as the elites. They were treated as the people who shouldn't be Christians because they were overcomplicating things. They were the bad guys. Or if you're in the 20th century, there was a question of, are you truly spirit-filled? If someone wasn't spontaneous, didn't have certain signs, they were the bad guys, not moved by the Spirit. More recently, you can see writers and other people who are suggesting that, amongst the evangelical church, there are the good guys and the bad guys. And we need to be very careful about the bad guys. And strangely, the bad guys are either all Republicans or all Democrats. They're just the ones who are the enemy. And what happens is people are persuaded. You have people who are able to gain a hearing because they are effective in their speech. And then they gain a following by making the people who listen feel good about themselves because we are not like them. Paul says, watch out. What they do is effective, and what they do is corrosive. Because really there are two things that are true about their teaching, two effects they have. First, they major on the minors. Because that's what you need to do. If you're going to major on Jesus, that's not going to divide people. Everyone who's a Christian is pro-Jesus. So you need to find something that's your particular niche, your thing. And by focusing on some minor thing as the thing that's really important, you end up disconnecting people from what matters most in Jesus. And you end up dividing people from each other. And you play into Satan's hands. Because this is what Satan delights in. People disconnected from Jesus, the church being divided, that is how in the moment he wins. And so Paul is unsparing. He says, watch out. Watch out when you see a speaker or you read someone where they feel powerful and effective and maybe even make you feel more important, but when you step back and think about it, you're not so sure. Watch out for those leaders who seem to be more interested in gaining a following than bringing that following towards Jesus. Watch out for those teachers who seem to be quite happy to bring apart division and seem very uninterested in building up the unity of the church. And when you see people like that, and when you have identified that carefully, he says, avoid them. Do not let their toxic teaching that is a message of Satan infect the unity and the bonds that you are meant to have with each other. Because there is a spiritual battle going on, and the community of which you are a part is the battleground itself. We are called to be participating in this glorious cosmic work that God is doing, and here is where we do it, we are told. One of the key ways is we are to greet, we are to care for each other, we are to deepen our bonds with each other, and we are to protect against those threats that seek to pull us apart. And as we do, the God of peace will crush Satan under our feet. I don't know, does this sound maybe, not big enough if we're talking about like the battle against Satan? If so, I suspect that's because we have been conned. I was listening to an interview with a professor by the name of Ligon Duncan, who is at Reformed Theological Seminary, a PCA pastor. And he said in his lifetime, he's now 65, every single election, he has been told that this is the most important election ever. And he says, Christians tend to overestimate the short-term importance of political decisions. We always think it's bigger than it actually is. And he says there's something that corresponds to that. Even as we so focus on that, we underestimate the long-term, what he calls drip, drip, drip influence that healthy churches have within their community. He says if you want to see the action, if you want to see what God is doing, that's where you look. That's where the battle actually is taking place. And that, Paul tells us in Romans, is our calling. To be wise, to be skillful at what is good and holding our community together, and to be resistant to the work of evil. And the God of peace will crush Satan under our feet. Would you please join with me